All right, welcome back. As promised, I'm joined now by Josh Taylor. Josh is a host and a producer at Trib Live Radio. He is a sports anchor at CBS Pittsburgh. I'm going to have to ask him if he knows my buddy John Burton. But I'm so excited to welcome to the show. We'll let him introduce himself to you guys, and you can get to know him a little bit. Josh, thanks so much for joining me.
And to answer your question, yes, I do know John Burton. John's a good friend of mine. He was actually, I'm going to date myself here, but I started working in TV it was almost 8 years ago.
Oh, yeah?
And the first sports director I worked under was John Burton at WTAE. I call him my big brother. He's one of my big brothers in TV industry. I learned a lot working under him and got a lot of opportunities to work with him. Really great guy. I'm sure they love him down in Nashville. He's doing big things as always.
Yes, we do. We love him. He's a great fella. And just a great addition to our sports coverage down here. And I like to kid around with him, but it's true, not hard on the eyes at all. So tell everybody out there a little. And he's got a sports fitness. He does training here. So if you're listening out there and you need training, you definitely need to hit John up. So tell everybody just a little bit about you. Are you a Steelers guy? Do you follow the team a lot?
Yeah, that's your question. I mean, born and raised in Pittsburgh. I've pretty much lived here the first 30 years of my life. Was born and raised a Pirates fan, a Steelers fan, a Penguins fan. And around 2012, I was working in TV for about 4 years here. Working before 2012, a job in Fayetteville, Arkansas, as a weekend sports anchor with the ABC affiliate there, and was in the heart of Razorback country, working in Fayetteville near the U of A, and did that for about 3 years, and last summer moved back home to Pittsburgh, wanted to be closer to my family and closer to my mom, and moved back home. And as soon as I got back, my feet hadn't really even touched the ground yet. A couple weeks later, Trib Live Radio called me, offered me a job to come back there, and that's it. And 6 months after that, I'm open to KDA, and I'd applied there for a previous job before, but wasn't hired, but something opened up. They reached out to me, and lo and behold, started working there as a part-time anchor and host and panelist with some of their talk shows that they have. And here we are now, a year and a half later, and it seems like it's been a whirlwind, but it's been great, and getting to cover sports in my hometown and doing the job I've been dreaming of doing since I was 11 years old. So it's been a great ride.
Living the dream, as they say, right?
Absolutely.
Well, you landed in a great spot. I listen to Trib Live Radio a lot, and they do great work. I really enjoy their product and what they do, and they do an excellent job. Big year for the Steelers. We're going to talk some Steelers. We'll get into the playoffs, talk about Vontaze Burfict and Adam Pac-Man Jones. Big year for the Steelers. They have advanced on to the Divisional Round. In your opinion, what do you credit for the success of the team this year?
It's got to be their depth, actually, and I think this is something that bears mentioning because Mike Tomlin has come under a lot of fire here in Pittsburgh from local fans. I mean, there's some fans and media members that believe that if certain things hadn't happened, for instance, had the Steelers lost to Cleveland in the season finale, they believe that Mike Tomlin should have lost his job. Even if that happened, I wouldn't have agreed with it. And in perspective, here's why. I mean, since the beginning of training camp, going into this season, and if you even want to count minicamp, the Steelers have had 4 quarterbacks. Bruce Gradkowski has been down for the season with a wrist injury or hand injury, so he was out for the season. So they had to go and sign Michael Vick. They've had 5 different running backs taking snaps and taking carries in the backfield. They've had 4 different kick returners receiving kicks. They've had 4 kickers kicking off for this team because 2 different ones got injured in training camp, and then one was so bad during the season they had to let him go and then sign another guy off the street. When you look at all those things, they lost their starting quarterback 4 different times to injury this season. They lost their starting running back, 6 or 7 weeks into the season. One of their top receivers was suspended for a couple of games. That same top running back that got injured, he was out for the first couple of games of the season. So when you add all those things together, and then injuries back and forth on the defense here and there, whether it was a corner, Ryan Shazier, the inside linebacker, he's been hurt a couple of different times on and off throughout the season. So you factor in injuries and suspensions and the number of guys that they've had to go through week after week and keep having to call different numbers and become, still in spite of all that, become a 10-6 team, win the playoffs, and then win your first playoff game. It's really hard to count that anything other than a success.
Yeah, I completely agree. You mentioned the suspensions and of course, the huge loss of Le'Veon Bell. I had Le'Veon Bell in one of my fantasy football leagues. I had so many injuries in that league that I exceeded the number of IR slots. You had slots for 5.
Wow.
Yeah, and so I couldn't put. I had carried Victor Cruz simply because it's a very deep league. There wasn't anybody else out there worth picking up that might have been better than him. But I had him and Steve Smith. I could not put on injured reserve simply because I had exceeded the number of allowed slots. We're going to talk about injuries here in a minute. I agree with you. It would have been, in my opinion, a knee-jerk move to move on from Mike Tomlin, who I think is an excellent coach. The Steelers aren't known for that, frankly, and the stability at the coaching position, in my opinion, has been one of the reasons for their success.
Oh, absolutely. And when you look at the number of coaches they've had since 1970, the number is 3. Chuck Noll, Bill Cowher, Mike Tomlin. That's it. And the amount of success has happened in that 36-year span is, it speaks for itself. And it's not just because of the coaches. It's because having that stability at the coaching position allows you to be able to deal with ebb and flow. You're going to have years when things are up. You're going to have years when things are down. And I agree. The knee-jerk reaction is something that some of these franchises continue to have. Things won't go away for 2 years, and they pull the trigger on another coach, or they clear out the GM, or they clean out everything. Yes, I'm talking about that city that's up near Lake Erie that Pittsburgh fans talk about a lot. But they're just an example of it.
Yeah, we're going to talk about it.
Yeah, there's other teams that go through that too. I mean, you're seeing it in places like Miami. You've seen it, in places like San Francisco. They're going through another coaching change, and it just kind of recycles itself over and over again. And it's really difficult to keep trying to build any kind of stability, build any kind of tradition, and become an attractive free agent destination for players that may want to come play for you, other than a hefty price tag attached. If you don't have that kind of stability and really a good franchise to build around, it makes it very difficult, much less even harder to try to build any kind of success or work towards becoming a championship organization.
I think that you're exactly right, and you mentioned one thing that I want to touch upon real quick, and then we'll move on to injuries and what have you. The casual fans do not understand what the lack of continuity can cost the team, not just in terms of buyouts and things of that nature, but in terms of what you have to pay free agents to come there.
Oh, yeah, and here's another thing that kind of gets lost in the shuffle. Not having continuity, it's also very hard to sell to a fan base. It's hard to sell. It's hard to get fans to buy season tickets when you keep having to introduce a new coach every couple of years. When you keep having to tell people, okay, well, this is our new franchise quarterback. No, this is our new franchise quarterback. No, this is our new franchise quarterback. And fans are sitting there going, wait a minute, what's going on here? And that's hard to build around. And it's hard to convince fans that you're giving them a product that they'll want to buy when you keep having to recycle or change or overhaul that product so regularly.
Yeah. It really is an unfortunate situation. And, jersey sales. The fans aren't going to buy jerseys if they know that there's going to be a lot of turnover and, that player might not be there next year. And I know for me, I quit buying jerseys a few years ago, simply because of that, partially because of that. It's rather unfortunate. The big news, I suppose, we're going to talk about Vontaze Burfict's suspension and Pat Jones's comments here in a minute, but the injury situation, it does not look like Antonio Brown is going to play. I've been on the air. We're recording this on Wednesday night, by the way. I've been on the air all afternoon. What is the latest on him? Is D'Angelo Williams healthy? Give us an injury update.
Well, the latest that we've heard with our guys over at the Trib is that Antonio Brown did not practice again today, not even any light workouts. He is still in the concussion protocol, so as of right now, his chances don't look very good, and you have to bear in mind that there's only maybe 2 days left for the Steelers to get practice in, and usually by Friday, they usually know who's playing and they know who's not. So if he's not at practice tomorrow and he's not at practice Friday, I think it's easy to assume that he will not participate on Sunday. DeAngelo Williams is the same situation. I mean, he's been seen walking without a walking boot around the facility on the south side of Pittsburgh. He's also been seen in a walking boot, but he hasn't been talking much to the media, which is usually not a good sign. If a player is not going to play or if he's not, even working towards practicing, they're usually not going to let him talk to the media because that's kind of how they just, try to keep that under wraps as far as, okay, well, he's not talking, he's obviously not practicing, and that's kind of how it goes. So that's been the case with DeAngelo Williams. Ben Roethlisberger, they've been strictly just talking about rest with him. I know they're still holding out hope that he may play. Right now, he's just dealing with rest with that injured shoulder, and mental reps have been pretty much the thing du jour for him right now, just making sure he's got, his game planning and play still down pat. So when the time comes to use that arm, if they allow him to do it, he'll be ready to go.
Yeah, with Big Ben, he's a tough guy. Everybody knows that. I don't remember what year it was. As I recall, he got injured in the playoffs, and there was some question, whether or not he was going to play, and he ended up playing. You want to think that, if he's at all able to go, that he will. How would you rate Landry Jones's performance in his absence?
Landry Jones is kind of an interesting study, and I think it really comes simply down to injury at home versus Landry Jones road. For him, a couple of times. We saw him on the road against Kansas City, where they lost that game to the Chiefs. We saw him on the road this past week against Cincinnati. He did not perform well. Of course, Vontaze Burfict picks off the pass that we thought would seal the game for the Bengals before that all fell apart. But home very well there in relief of Michael Vick. It actually showed up pretty well. Played fairly well against Oakland when Ben Roethlisberger was knocked out of that game. Landry Jones steps in. Even though Oakland came back to tie the game, Landry Jones steps in, makes a couple of plays, throws it past Antonio Brown. He turns it into a big game. DeAngelo Williams turns into a big game. They kick the game-winning field goal, and then you hear that's two wins with Landry Jones showing up in relief. But those are both games that happened at home. With the prospect of him starting on the road in Denver, considering that he hasn't been very good on the road so far for the Steelers, it doesn't sound very good, in my opinion, if Landry Jones is named the starter.
Yeah, you've seen some flashes from him. Obviously, he's not Ben Roethlisberger. You don't expect him to be. Since we're sort of dancing around it, let's go ahead and talk about Vontaze Burfict and Adam Pac-Man Jones. The situation with Antonio Brown. Did you think that someone? It was toward the end of the game. Did you think someone should have been ejected for that?
I didn't think someone should have been ejected for the hit itself. I mean, it's more because it's not like the rule book is the same in the NFL as it is in college. Maybe if that's an NCAA game, maybe it's labeled as targeting. Maybe Vontaze Burfict is ejected for targeting, and I know a lot of people don't like that rule, and this is probably one of those reasons why, because it's so hard and vague and really difficult to figure out what exactly that entails. So I don't know if it would have been an ejectable offense. Now, maybe if it's a helmet-to-helmet hit, now we're talking about something that's probably worth looking into. But it was shoulder-to-helmet, even though it was, by letter of the rule, a hit on a defenseless receiver. I don't know if it was, ejection quality as far as being that egregious. But, at the same time, when Adam Pac-Man Jones did, I also don't think, in the context of it all, and I think there's a lot of confusion as to why he was called for a flag. A lot of people think he was flagged for his confronting Joey Porter, and that's not the reason. The reason why he was called for unsportsmanlike conduct was because he got in contact with an official while confronting Joey Porter. And, of course, we all know touching the referee or coming in contact with the referee is a huge no-no. So when you're talking about whether or not it was, of that kind of quality to be ejected from the game, maybe worthy of that, I don't think it was. But at the same time, it was worth the flags because they have to follow by the letter of the rule.
Yeah, in Antonio Brown's situation, you don't lose. In my opinion, and I don't think I'm alone here, he's the best wide receiver in the league. I know Odell Beckham Jr. gets a lot of press. For my money, I would take Antonio Brown. They're both excellent, don't get me wrong. With his loss, you've got some young talent behind him that can pick up the slack. Martavis Bryant such an exciting young player. Marcus Wheaton, you see flashes from him, and Darius Hayward-Bay has, had a pretty nice season as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. With Hayward-Bay, he's made some plays there that I think have surprised a lot of people. I mean, one of the big knocks against Hayward-Bay throughout his career was that he had fantastic speed, could get down the field very quickly and make plays down the field, but the question was the reliability of his hands. Could he hang on to the ball if it was thrown to him? He's actually been able to do that a handful of times this season, and Ben Roethlisberger trusts him immensely. You saw a lot of work during the preseason. I was able to cover training camp, and you would see a lot of work with Ben Roethlisberger throwing downfield to Darius Hayward-Bay, and we're looking at it going, and live drills are going, was that Darius Hayward-Bay that caught that ball? And kind of even caught some of the reporters and us media guys off guard, that the kind of trust that Ben Roethlisberger has in him. But it's actually been paying off to a degree. He's been able to make some of those plays. And another guy that doesn't really get talked about a lot, but I think has been able to make plays when called upon, even though it's sparingly, is Marcus Wheaton. And this is a question that I actually posed to some of my colleagues at Trib Live Radio one day. We were talking about Martavis Bryant and the challenge that Ben Roethlisberger issued to him. And the question I posed was, there's another option. Who leads the team in yards per reception during the regular season? The answer was Marcus Wheaton. He had 17.5 yards, and Martavis Bryant, I think, was 17.1. And if you want a good example as to how Marcus Wheaton can be dangerous, look no further than the Seattle game. Seattle made it a point to try to take Antonio Brown out of the game. They really tried to limit Martavis Bryant deep, so it really opened up a lot of opportunities for Heath Miller, the tight end, who also has become a very reliable option over the years. And Marcus Wheaton had the biggest game of his career, 9 catches, over 200 yards, scored a couple touchdowns, and that was really the game that brought him kind of out of the shadows, so to speak. He's kind of the number 4 guy, if you want to count Antonio Brown, number 1, Martavis Bryant 2, and maybe Heath Miller 3. But Marcus Wheaton is a very reliable guy, too, that when called upon has been able to produce for this team and have some pretty good results.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of young, kind of unheralded guys, a young, relatively unknown, I had never heard of the guy, really stepped up in that game against the Cincinnati Bengals. I'm probably going to butcher his name. I hope that you'll help me out here. Fitzgerald Toussaint?
Fitzgerald Toussaint, you are correct. And he's a guy that a lot of people didn't really know about. He had a pretty good career at Michigan. I mean, he's a guy that's had a lot of carries and volumes, and everybody knows Michigan running backs are used to having the ball constantly. So it's not like running the ball is a foreign concept to Fitzgerald Toussaint. But I'll throw another name in there, and I wrote a blog about this earlier this week. It was him and Jordan Todman, a kid from Villanova, who has moved around the league quite a bit. I mean, he's played another organization before, but the Steelers brought him in for this particular situation. If any of either of their top 2 running backs were to go down, Jordan Todman would be the next man up, to steal Mike Tomlin's idiom, as he likes to use. But Jordan Todman and Fitzgerald Toussaint, the interesting thing about these two is that they both bring separate things to the table. Toussaint's more of a power guy, run between the tackles, really good in pass protection, caught passes out of the backfield. I believe he caught 4 passes for 60 yards against Cincinnati, which was a really big added element, 118 total yards in that game, which, by the way, was the 3rd most yards from scrimmage by an undrafted player in team history, behind Willie Parker, who did it against San Diego some years back, and also Isaac Redmond did it in the game against Denver, that playoff game against Denver, I believe it was 5 years ago. So you're looking at a pretty interesting performance, all of them by undrafted running backs, no less, but Fitzgerald Toussaint absolutely steps in and does a great job, and Jordan Todman as well. Both those guys create a really good complement, and they even have embraced the thought of, being able to both going in and doing the job. They don't look at it as a competition. They look at it as more of a compliment. They trust that one guy will go in and do the job, and the other guy will go in and clean it up. And they weren't great. They weren't legendary. It wasn't a record-setting performance, but it was good enough for the Steelers to have faith in their running game and not become one-dimensional, and add an element to the passing game and have their offense be at least good enough to win the game.
Yeah, Jordan Todman, a guy I'm familiar with. I was not at all shocked that he had a solid game. I had an opportunity to see him play when he was with the Jacksonville Jaguars. And he ran all over the Tennessee Titans, which isn't surprising either. They've had issues with their run defense for a while now. We're not going to talk about the Titans. We touched upon this a little bit. Let's talk about Pac-Man Jones and Vontaze Burfict. He was suspended. Pac-Man Jones came out and said that he would apologize to Antonio Brown if he was only if he missed the next game. Those kinds of things. Let's talk about the suspension first. Warranted or not?
It's warranted, and it's not. And this is another thing that needs to be clarified. I think people are thinking that he got suspended specifically for that hit on Antonio Brown, and that's not the case. It's because he's a much what's what I'm looking for? Multiple repeat offender of the league's safety rules. And when you're a multiple offender that way, that's what happens, and you eventually get suspended. And the best thing I can come up with, the best analogy I can think of is, if you're a hockey fan, you're probably familiar with Matt Cook, who played with the Penguins for a number of years here, and he was a guy who had a reputation of making some bad hits, some dirty hits on players. And eventually, after so many times it happened, you get fined or you get suspended, and that's exactly what happened with Matt Cook. It's really the same thing with Vontaze Burfict. The league pays attention to those things. Like, your clock doesn't start again at zero after you make that kind of play. They add up over time. It's kind of like technical fouls in the NBA. You collect so many over a certain season, you're going to have to sit out a game. It's the same thing with those kind of penalties by violating the league safety rules, and that's what happened with Vontaze Burfict.
Yeah, it's kind of, I don't want to, and it's sort of like the Brandon Merriweather rule, right? I mean,
right,
he's a guy,
exactly.
Yeah, he's a guy who had that history as well, and Michael Griffin got caught up in that too. He's a hard. Both of those guys are safeties, and Vontaze Burfict is a linebacker, but still kind of the same situation. Pac-Man Jones and his non-apology. What do you make of all of that?
It's frustrating, and not the response that, not even with the allegations that Antonio Brown was faking it. It's just, if you can whether the fact that he hasn't practiced for 2 games be a big enough sign that maybe this is real. I've never heard of a player fake an injury in a game, in a playoff game that his team happens to win, and then not practice for the 3 days following it, getting ready for the next game. That's a lot of faking, and it probably takes faking an injury to an egregious new level. I mean, we've seen some pranks go to great lengths. That's not a very, very effective lengthy prank if that's the case. The fact that he hasn't practiced and he's in the concussion in this league and knows how things work and how injury reports work and the protocols that teams have with players practicing. That's something that should stand out to him. And it makes me wonder if he's even paying attention or if he's just using it as an opportunity to get his side of the story out there. But yeah, it's very irresponsible, if you ask me. And it's something that shouldn't be taken that lightly as something as a player that's pretty much knocked unconscious on the field. And he's using him and faking it and saying, oh, I'll apologize if he doesn't play next week. What if he doesn't practice the whole week leading up to that? Does that change your mind? Figure it would, to a person that's thinking sensibly.
It's ridiculous. Anybody watching that game knows. Antonio Brown was out cold. He was not faking. I don't want to talk too much about the Bengals. We talked a little bit about that on today's show. Let's go ahead and talk about the matchup versus the Broncos. The Broncos are a tough draw at home anyway. They have now turned back to Peyton Manning, a guy who's not the same quarterback as he was, back in the day, so to speak, but still a formidable threat. And they've got a great defense and a pretty darn good team, or they wouldn't be where they are. Give us your thoughts on that. What matchups are you most interested in, and what do you think about this game?
Well, the first thing I'm looking at is that, when these two teams met just a few weeks ago, there was a difference with Denver's defense. And this is considering the fact that Denver has the number 1 defense in the league for a reason. But in the first meeting, Denver was without their top 3 safeties. They didn't have Darian Stewart, they didn't have T.J. Wharton, they didn't have Omar Bolton. So do you wonder if that made a difference in the game? I'm not really sure, because it was really more of Antonio Brown and how well he played against Chris Harris, and he hadn't allowed a touchdown in 2 years. And that game ended up becoming probably the worst game of Chris Harris's career. At least that's what they're saying in Denver, as far as how that performance was. So that's one thing that would stick out to me, is that Denver's secondary is now completely healthy, and Antonio Brown is the guy whose health is in question. So that's one thing that makes this matchup different. Also, in that first game, Denver had Brock Osweiler starting at quarterback. Now it's Peyton Manning. So now that becomes a different scenario. And also, To boot, Ben Roethlisberger's status is in doubt. And he was one of the guys that was behind that second half comeback. I mean, we talked about it here in Pittsburgh being a game of two halves where Denver's offense dominated the first half and Pittsburgh's dominated the second half. So one of the guys being involved in that, or two of them when you count Brown and Roethlisberger, and both of those guys being questionable at this point to play in the game, it does change the dynamic. I'll go far enough to say if they have Ben Roethlisberger and not Antonio Brown, I still give them a shot to win the game. I still think they have a chance, but it relies heavily on Roethlisberger's performance. However, without Roethlisberger and with Antonio Brown, I don't know if I'm as confident, but that's what it becomes, and that's the one thing we're going to be keeping an eye on throughout the rest of this week is which one of these two guys play, if both play, or if either of them play. I think it changes the dynamic in any direction.
Yeah, I think so too. You cannot understate, in my opinion, playoff experience for a quarterback. In the playoffs, it's so important, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It really does. It drives a game plan. I think as far as you don't want to force a player to make mistakes, and a player that's playing in the playoffs for the first time, you're going to probably see coaches want to give them opportunities to not only do things well, but put them in situations where they're not thinking too much. Because the thing is, you want to make it as simple as possible, because the simpler it is, maybe the less likely you are to make mistakes. And winning playoff football games does not always come down to which team lights up the stat sheet or lights up the scoreboard. Sometimes it comes down to the team that makes the fewer mistakes.
Exactly.
And if you're the quarterback that makes more mistakes because maybe you're not able to remember everything, or maybe you're, pressing too hard, or the game plan might have been a little bit bigger than you were ready for, it does make a difference. So when you have a guy like Peyton Manning or a guy like Ben Roethlisberger, when that's your option, as opposed to maybe going to Brock Osweiler or going to Landry Jones, it does make a difference in how you prepare and probably how you expect your quarterback to perform.
Yeah, I thought, just speaking of which, I just want to toss this out there. We're not going to rehash the wild card games, but I thought Teddy Bridgewater played for a first time, a first-time quarterback in the playoffs. Thought he had a really nice game last week, and it was unfortunate the missed field goal knocked them out. How did you rate his performance?
I say this knowing that, Teddy Bridgewater came in with some expectations. I'm a big fan of Teddy Bridgewater. I think he's a very, very capable quarterback, and I thought he did a great job with what Minnesota had this season. And this is something that people probably won't want to hear, but Teddy Bridgewater now can say he quarterbacked a team that winning a division title, and they beat out the Green Bay Packers to do it. And that's something he now has on his resume. And the way he played in that game, I agree with you. I thought, and this comes back to the last thing we discussed. I mean, Teddy Bridgewater wasn't great, but he was good enough to keep the team in it, and they were in position to win. And they can't say they didn't win that game because of him, because he at least led them down the field at the time he needed to. He performed when needed, even though they only put up 9 points, and which should have potentially been maybe 12 points if Blair Walsh makes that final kick. But sometimes it's better to be lucky than good, and sometimes it's better to be effective than maybe just, the more dominant guy. And there probably wasn't that kind of setting with the weather, with Seattle's defense, and with the way that game turned out. There really was no dominant player, so to speak. Sometimes you just have to be the guy that makes the plays when the opportunity presents itself. And Teddy Bridgewater, I thought, made enough.
Yeah, I agree. Much was made of none of the home teams won. As I recall, none of the home teams were successful in the wild card round. I think all the visiting teams won those matchups. It's going to be a much different situation in the divisional round, don't you think?
Oh, sure. I think it changes everything when the teams that got byes, when New England and Denver and Arizona and Carolina are the teams hosting games, when you consider that Carolina won, 14 games, I think Arizona won 13, and I think the Patriots won, 12. So, and if I'm not mistaken, I think Denver won 12 or 11 or 12. So you have teams that won games at a pretty high clip here, and they did it doing certain things. And we know in Carolina that of all those 4 teams that are hosting games, they're probably the healthiest team, and they may be the most balanced team. Yeah. Having that offense with Cam Newton doing what he's done, and that defense, it's not talked about enough. Kuechly and Davis, really Norman, and that crew, and what they've really done there and put together. Ron Rivera putting together a team that doesn't really do a lot with them. He lets those guys go out and he lets them play. He doesn't have to really put hands on with a lot because These guys have really embraced the collective, first of all, but then they've also gotten behind Kuechly and Newton, and these are the guys that are leading that charge. And they're just going out and playing, and they're doing everything right, except for, a couple of things here and there that might have cost them games before the large part. They're just doing it right when they're expected to get it done.
I'm a big fan of Ron Rivera and the job that he's done with the Panthers. And we'll talk about the NFC matchups just briefly here in a minute. But I want to ask you about Chiefs at Patriots. I've been saying, I hope I don't jinx them. I'm a big fan of Andy Reid and what Alex Smith has accomplished in Kansas City. I just feel like this could possibly be that year for them. Obviously, they've got to go to Foxborough. Tough place to play. The Patriots are a tough draw regardless. What do you think of that matchup?
If there's one matchup that I expect could be the potential road team winning this weekend, it's that one. Kansas City is very, very impressive to me. And this is going to sound like a broken record, but Kansas City has been doing a very good job. And this is not just within the past couple weeks. It's been almost the past 3 months. Kansas City's won 11 games in a row. That's worth pointing out. And they haven't done it blowing teams away. They've done it by being the more efficient team, the more mistake-free team, and making plays when it's necessary. And they've been doing it for almost 3 months now. And then once you get to a rhythm like that and you understand how to get it done, they face a team that has the injuries, that has its share of problems. Tom Brady has been knocked around more than he has in the majority of his career. And Kansas City is a team, matchup-wise, that their front seven can make it very, very complicated for New England. Don Terry Poe, very good in the middle. Those two guys off the edges. Holly. Oh, Don Terry Poe is fantastic. He's a really great player.
He doesn't get enough attention. He does not get enough attention. He's fantastic.
Oh, it's an unsung position. It's really the life of a nose tackle where you're not going to get a lot of credit because you're doing so much dirty work. You're taking on double teams. You're not making the backfield. Does space. And he makes it easier for guys like Derek Johnson to get into the backfield. He makes it easier for Justin Houston and Tom Ali, who, by the way, are both healthy now, which makes them as formidable as ever. And the one thing I would say is that if we've known how to get to Tom Brady, it's A-gap pressure. It's that pressure up the middle. Don Terry Poe has a lot to do with that, opening up some space. If Derek Johnson can get into Brady's face or if they can stunt and twist and to get into his line of sight and make it more complicated for him, I think Kansas City can make it a really long day in Foxborough and maybe just make enough plays and minimize mistakes just enough to eke out a win against the team in New England that does the same thing. What's the best way to beat New England? Play mistake-free football. And no one does it better right now than Kansas City.
I completely agree. I'm so excited about that game. Packers, Cardinals, and then we'll talk real briefly about Seahawks, Panthers. Packers, Cardinals, the Arizona Cardinals right now favored to win the Super Bowl. The Packers came on strong. They had a really strong game last weekend against Washington, a team that benefited very much from a weak division. I don't see any way the Packers can knock them off, do you?
No. Arizona at home might be the best team in football, and that's with great respect to Carolina and what Carolina's done at home. Arizona at home has been a very efficient machine, and Green Bay was just there a couple weeks ago, and I think Arizona beat them to the tune of 33-8.
Yeah.
And it really that 8 points might have been more of a lip service than anything. But the way Arizona plays when they're at home, they're an entirely different football team. They're not bad on the road either, but they're a much better football team at home. Actually, those teams are very similar. Green Bay is a much better team at home than they are on the road. But I see Arizona winning this game pretty easily, and that's nothing against Aaron Rodgers, but the Packers and the way that they've been able to overcome a lot of injuries here and there, overcoming not having Jordy Nelson. It's been pretty incredible how they've been able to get this far. But I think a healthier team in Arizona, I think a better defense in Arizona. That's without Tyrann Mathieu, who was well on his way to maybe being a Defensive Player of the Year candidate before he got injured. But the way this defense is playing, they've got so many guys. I mean, you can really just stack them up on a list of guys that are stepping up and making plays. I think Arizona's defense is good. I think Carson Palmer might be having the best year of his career. He's just been really, really good. And this is at an advanced stage after a couple of injuries, but he's playing really good football right now. You can argue that he was one of the top 3 quarterbacks in the league this season, so you add that all up.
Yeah.
It really does favor Arizona right now.
I'm a big fan of Carson Palmer. I'm so happy for him. And I like Uncle Bruce Arians. I think he's done a fantastic job. You know, you're probably familiar with him from his Pittsburgh Steelers days.
Oh yeah. Oh, Bruce Arians. There's an interesting history as far as the Steelers and Bruce Arians and his alleged retirement that became him dismissed. And I make the joke all the time. If I could have a retirement like Bruce Arians, maybe I'll retire before I turn 40.
Yeah, no way.
And that's not even counting what he did in Indianapolis. People forget he was in Indianapolis as their offensive coordinator. Chuck Pagano gets diagnosed with leukemia. Bruce Arians becomes the interim head coach, and the Colts take off from there, and they win all these games, and he gets named Coach of the Year, goes to Arizona, and really makes his franchise, which was another one that had been going through a lot of changes here and there and kind of overhauling back and forth regularly. They find their guy in Bruce Arians, and he turns them into a very, very good franchise. They've had a couple years of continuity, and they've become a pretty formidable team, and I'm not surprised that a lot of people think that this team can win the Super Bowl because I believe that they're good enough to end up in the Super Bowl also.
Yeah, I think so too. They probably would have done it last year unless if Carson Palmer did not go down. They don't have anybody really behind him, just like a lot of other teams. Seahawks, Panthers. The Hawks are hot. You know, they've been playing some really good football. I'm not sure what Marshawn Lynch's status is. It's kind of a surprising no-show in the last game. Can the Seahawks go into Carolina and beat the Panthers?
They can. If anybody can do it, it's Seattle as far as being able to go on the road and do it, even without Marshawn Lynch. And, that means probably we'll see a lot of Christine Michael. Russell Wilson is still a pretty good quarterback as far as maybe not blowing you off the map, but at least making plays when it's necessary. And they still have a pretty good receiver combo there. They're not names that jump off the page, but they are pretty good. Doug Baldwin's still making plays there. And you have those guys. Tyler Lockett is a player that as a rookie has really impressed me. Going into the draft last season, I expected the Steelers to draft a receiver, but I was hoping that they would draft a receiver that not only could make plays as a slot receiver, but also do that in special teams. And that's exactly what Tyler Lockett is doing for Seattle. And he's doing it so well that it kind of makes me feel like Tyler Lockett might have been the one that got away from the Steelers, and that if he's drafted instead of Sammy Coates in black and gold, I think it's a much different season as far as the wide receiver position. But he's been really good for Seattle, and that defense has finally found its stride because those guys are healthy again in the secondary, and they're getting back to being what they are. So yeah, it's very, very easy to think that Seattle can win that game in Carolina. And here's another thing: never discount motivation, because Carolina went to Seattle and beat Seattle in Seattle. So the Seahawks, if they have something they can rally around and have a chip on their shoulder, they're going to try to use that to their advantage as motivation to beat Carolina on their home field and snatch a chance to maybe win a Super Bowl, and what could have been their best regular season ever in franchise history.
I'm so excited for that game. I think it's going to be absolutely fantastic. It's one of the kickoff games. I believe it's the early game. Great stuff, Josh. Before you get out of here, I want to ask you, what is your off-season wish list for the Steelers?
Off-season wish list, health at cornerback. They drafted 2 corners, Deron Grant, St. Claus Golson. Grant is buried down at the bottom of the depth chart. He has not seen the field. Golson was pretty much sidelined after minicamp with a shoulder injury. He did not see the field all year, so definitely some health and maybe some added depth at the corner position. I wouldn't mind them seeing that same thing I wished for last year, maybe a wide receiver to bring in that can play in the sub packages and return kicks and punts. That would be something that they can add to it. I think they definitely going to need help on the offensive line. They got a couple contracts that are expiring. Kelvin Beacham's contract is up, but he's been injured. He's on IR. He will probably be headed out, as well as Ramon Foster. His contract's up. So they're going to have to make some decisions on the offensive line. David DeCastro's contract is up, I believe, next year. They're going to have to decide to sign him. Le'Veon Bell's contract is up after next year. So they're going to have to definitely make some moves as far as, fortifying the offensive line and getting some guys signed. And I think the third thing would be a guy to start getting ready behind Ben Roethlisberger. I'm pretty much convinced that Landry Jones' future is probably somewhere else as a backup. I don't know if it's in Pittsburgh. I don't know if they can trust him to be that guy to step in for a Ben Roethlisberger that, frankly, we've gotten glimpses as to what life might be like without him. So maybe it might be time to find that quarterback in the second or third round and maybe start have him hold a clipboard, but getting him ready to step in within a couple of years when Ben Roethlisberger's time is finished.
Yeah, I agree. At some point, they've definitely got to look for the future. They're like a lot of teams in that regard, and be interesting to see how their off season, their free agency and draft goes down. So it's such a pleasure to have you on. Tell everybody where they can find you out there on social media and listen to your show and catch you on television.
Oh, definitely. On Twitter, _Josh Taylor _. The radio station is Trib Live Radio. It's actually run by the Pittsburgh Tribune Review newspaper, but you can check us out, sportstalk.triblive.com. You can download the podcast on iTunes and also on Podcast Addict. Also, KDKA, KDK TV definitely is the place to be. I believe it's KDKA.com, or also I believe it's CBS Pittsburgh Local. You can catch me in either of those places there, and it's, pretty cut and dry, but it's a lot of great opportunities and a lot of great places to catch it. And also I have a fan page on Facebook. I believe it's JT on Sports is the name on Facebook, facebook.com/JT on Sports. You can find me there also.
All right, we'll be tweeting all this stuff out. So thanks again for joining me. Great stuff. Have a great night.
You do the same. It's been great, and hope to talk to you again soon.
I hope so, too.
All right, thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.